Hello, and welcome to another episode of Undiscovered Beasts and Strange Phenomena. Please join our experienced and knowledgeable panel of hosts as we explore the great mysteries of our time: Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, and unexplained phenomena.
Hello, and welcome to Swamp Shadows, Tales from the Tupelos. I'm your host, Mike Richburg. Thank you for joining me. Very happy to have you here. I'm very proudly broadcasting as part of the Undiscovered Beast and Strange Phenomena broadcast family. Many of us enjoy a good sea monster story, or maybe river monster encounters or lake monsters in the sort. We often think about places like Scotland or British Columbia or maybe Lake Champlain in Vermont. But the southeastern United States has a rich history of unusual encounters with strange aquatic creatures. I would like to talk to you a little bit tonight about that. It's a subject I find very fascinating, as I'm sure many others do as well. There is no shortage, as I mentioned, of sightings. A very rich history indeed. Particularly 4 areas that we want to take a look at would be the St. Johns River, the Altamaha River, Lake Murray, and Lake Norman. These areas are scattered along a line roughly running from Charlotte, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. Something on the order of 300 or 400 miles maybe, I don't know. Well, without looking at the map, just off the top of my head. Basically in a straight line, give or take. Not a tremendously large disbursement, fairly well concentrated geographically speaking. They each have a long history of encounters with various types of alleged creatures. Indeed, it's quite a mixed bag in almost every case, and in other cases and less significant bodies of water. If you look at the geology and geography, if you will, the Altamaha River, the St. Johns River, and the Santee River, which ultimately connects to both Lake Murray and Lake Norman, are all very large, significant river systems. They all produce a good flow of water, especially, in the rainy season, if you will, but not among the nation's top freshwater discharges typically. However, all these rivers, all 3 of them, and a river very close to where the Santee joins the Atlantic, the Waccamaw, which is really the PD, the Great PD River system, also produce or generate a large estuary or brackish water habitat, a marshland area where these rivers feed into the Atlantic. That might be very important, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. All these rivers stretch from in the case of the 2 in the Carolinas, the PD River system and the Santee River system, they stretch well into the Piedmont area of the Carolinas. The Savannah River is also right there amongst all this, and we would probably include the Savannah to some degree. It's not quite the river system of those other 3 or 4 rivers I just mentioned, but it's certainly right in the middle of the mix there, so to speak. The Altamaha is one of the largest river basins in the United States, second only to the mighty Mississippi River from a drainage basin standpoint. The St. Johns River in Florida is also very significant at over 300 miles long. So you have some very significant waterways that all empty into the Atlantic Ocean in a fairly narrow bandwidth, if you will, of latitude. Not too far north from there, up above Wilmington, you get into Morehead City, North Carolina, you start getting into the Outer Banks, and the lay of the land's a little bit different there. Further south, below the St. Johns, below Jacksonville, there's no other rivers really that would compare to the St. Johns. So you have these very large river systems feeding into a certain area of the Atlantic right there, and all these rivers feed into the Atlantic between basically Georgetown, South Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida, and that's probably about a 200-mile stretch of coastline. So a fairly narrow bandwidth of latitude. Similar environment, large coastal estuary areas. All right. Well, as far as the history of what's been going on in these different places, in each case, the history extends back a great deal of time. In the St. Johns River is a good example. Many sightings from antiquity of a creature said to be not unlike a plesiosaur in appearance, large body, flippers, long neck. Most of the sightings from antiquity would reflect either that type of morphology, or what is also very common is a large eel type animal of great proportion. In 1975, there were 5 individuals in a motorboat in the St. Johns River and had a very close encounter with what they described something that looked somewhat like a dragon. And very famously, one of the eyewitnesses, a lady that was in the boat at the time of this close range encounter, described the animal in great detail, even features of the face and things like that, the drooping mouth, and she described the eyes and like almost horn-like stubby protrusions on the top of the head. Well, she famously described it as being pinkish in color, and therefore that became a favorite thing among the media and whatnot, so it became known as Pinky. And what she described, the coloration was, she said it was kind of pink, like a shrimp or something. All right, so, well, of course, the media took off with that. There's a pink monster in St. Johns River. So it was Pinky. The term Pinky was coined. And then later on, more contemporary sightings of a pink dolphin and something else that was believed to be in the river that was also pink in color, bright pink, that is, were attributed to, of course, sightings of Pinky, quote unquote, but that might not have been anything all that unusual. But nonetheless, the term pinky stuck, and some people mistakenly call the St. John's River monster Pinky. Well, Pinky might be a St. John's River monster, but it's not the St. John's River monster, because long before that sighting, there were reports of animals, strange animals in the river. If you move just up the coast there to the Altamaha is a massive river system fed by 3 other rivers with a massive brackish water estuary area where it joins the ocean there again. There was long been sightings of something very strange in the Altamaha River. Even the Native Americans in the area had legends of some strange animal said to inhabit the river. The town of Darien, Georgia, just north of Brunswick there, is right there at the mouth of the Altamaha, where the Butler River and another river, the Champney, perhaps, I cannot remember off the top of my head, joined Altamaha right there at the coast. There have been quite a number of sightings in and around the area of Darien there, near the estuary area where this mighty river comes into the ocean. A long running history of reports of an animal that is typically described as not unlike a plesiosaur. There again, an animal with flippers and a long neck. Now, there was famously a 2018 hoax conducted by some individual that was seeking attention, whereas they used a stuffed shark and some paper mache and some clever photography to basically construct a false sighting, and took a photograph and reported it to people nearby, and it took off, and eventually, Georgia game and wildlife people got involved, things like that. Nothing really came out of it because, of course, there again, it was just a paper mache model for all practical purposes. It's unfortunate when that type of thing happens, but at the same time, it does raise awareness to a certain level about the overall phenomenon. Because some people, even in Georgia, had never heard of the Altamaha. Many settlers in that region, in the coastal region of Georgia there, are of Scottish descent. So one might propose that they might be predispositioned to believe in such a thing as that, and be maybe even looking for it before they saw it, type of thing. But we don't know that. But we do know there's a lot of different people, including Native American, have seen strange things in that river. And that's something we can kind of go with. But bear in mind, there is a possibility that some witnesses living in the region might have already been familiar with some similar folklore from where they came from hundreds of years ago. Very interesting, the story of the Altamaha and the Altamaha River monster. Many accounts, most of them, reflect the creature with flippers and a long neck. There again. A few accounts of a large eel or snake-like creature as well. And that's worth noting because that's also a recurring theme. One of the most compelling reports I ever received about a cryptid is my buddy Mark, and I hate to say the gentleman's name because I never asked him if I could use his name. and I'm not going to call a witness's name, but this gentleman, I was put in contact with this gentleman. He is retired Navy. He was a lifer. I'll probably screw this rank up. I believe he told me he was, and I don't know U.S. Navy rank, and I apologize to all those brothers and sisters out there serving our country if I don't get this correctly. Senior Chief Petty Officer. All right, so he's somebody that been in the Navy a long time, seen a lot of Navy ships, seen a lot of water, been around the block a few times. Gentleman lived in Delaware. He was traveling to Jacksonville, him and his wife. They stopped at a scenic overlook, like a wildlife observation area, right there near Darien, Georgia, at the Altamaha River. He had a sighting. He and his wife both saw this thing that he described as a very dull, kind of unremarkable color, maybe like a dull greenish to brown, kind of just mud color animal that had a very large body that he couldn't really make out well. But it had a long neck, and he said it had a head on it, much like a seal. The head was not, it almost like, if you could just see the head, it was like the head of a seal, but it was on this long neck, hooked to this body. And he described this thing as being an animate, living object that he could see quite well, he and his wife. He said it moved against the tide, and that's very important to me. Because, you could have a log or something, old tree out there floating around, rolling over, into water. That happens. But if it's moving against the tide, then it's probably making its own propulsion. So that's definitely worth noting. The gentleman said the thing went under twice while they were observing it over a matter of just a couple minutes. They lost sight of the thing, never saw it again. But he saw it. Well, like with a lot of reports, I like to kind of verify things, and I, of course, had asked the gentleman, about weather conditions and the tide and things like that. And everything he told me matched up. The weather was exactly as he claimed on that day, and the tide even matched with the time he gave me and everything. So here you got a man that's basically spent his whole adult life in the Navy, on the ocean. He knows a thing or two about the ocean. So you have to think he's a fairly credible observer. When he says, it wasn't like any animal he has ever seen before, that's cause for taking notice, in my mind. Very, very credible individual. Had no reason, didn't want any attention, had no reason to make the story up or whatever. I like credible witnesses. They lend credence. It's one thing if Billy Joe Bob beats one off the boat with the paddle or something, and that was all half cotton on Budweiser. But when a gentleman has spent his life on the water like that, tells you he knows what he saw, and it's nothing like anything he's seen, then that's definitely gets your attention. Moving further north, if you look at Lake Murray and Lake Norman, they both feed, like I say, into the Santee River system, which has been massively altered. Of course, in the last 100 years or so, man has built many dams in the area. Many. And the Santee River is no exception, and its tributaries. The Santee project, the Santee Cooper project, constructed two large lakes just prior to World War II and diverted inevitably through the use of a couple canals much of the water that was going down the Santee directly into the Cooper River, which was a more direct path to travel, much more direct route to Charleston, if you will. All right, so, but nonetheless, until the last 100 years, the Santee lied there mostly untouched. Lake Murray has a very thorough, perhaps the most numerous sightings of any of these locations we're discussing. I, of course, lived on Lake Murray for a few years, part of the time growing up. I've been lucky enough to spend time on a lot of different lakes here in South Carolina, growing up, fishing and hanging out, boating and swimming and whatnot, skiing. Lake Murray is a beautiful lake and a great recreational area. It's a fairly large lake. It's about 50,000 acres. That's fairly sizable. It's fairly deep at probably about 190 feet at the deepest point. People will tell you it's deeper than that, but it's not. It's less than 200 feet deep, probably. Long history of sightings. And, of course, if you're like me and you spent time growing up in the region, you had to at some point hear the story about the divers that went down to clean something off the dam, off the spillway intakes or something, and saw the giant catfish as big as a car down there. That's a recurring story that's told about a lot of lakes. Okay, I got to just pull that out there and be honest with you. Lake Norman also has similar stories. But those stories are there for whatever they're worth. And certainly there could be some very large catfish, maybe not as big as a car, I don't know, but there's some big catfish in the Carolinas. There's no doubt about that. But most older reports in Lake Murray, particularly those from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, were very much there again. The morphology sounded a lot like a plesiosaur or what might be, your typical Loch Ness monster type description. Big body, flippers, long neck with a head on it. Right? However, many reports and most of the more contemporary reports are that of a very large snake or eel-like animal. There again, that same pattern, whereas the morphology tends to fall more often than not in one of those two categories. It's the plesiosaur type animal and the giant eel type animal. Speaking of credible witnesses, this is one thing that one of my little peeves. Now, there was an account of the Lake Murray monster trying to get in a boat or attack a boat on the lake. And the individuals went back and fetched a shotgun, and it was widely reported in the news media and outlets at the time. But a lot of people did not give that report very much credence, as I think it was established there was some Budweisers or something involved. So I won't mention the individuals' names or anything like that. It was widely reported in the news. Whereas they were fishing or boating around and just happened to pull up into this cove where this thing was at, and it didn't like them being there, and it turned on the boat and they indeed had to whack it with paddles and stuff. That's why I mentioned that earlier. I don't know if you could think of a more credible witness, however, than U.S. Army General retired Marvin B. Corder of Fort Jackson, South Carolina, who, in a letter in 1990 to no less than the South Carolina Department of Fish and Game, said that he and his son had seen twice, not just once, but on two different occasions, a very large, something on the magnitude of 40 to 60 foot long, serpent-like creature, was said to have the head and the body of a snake, but the tail of an eagle. Sighted twice near Chapin, South Carolina, not too far from Billy Dreer Island. If you're from around here, you know exactly where that is. Now, when Bub and Billy Joe beat one off the boat with the paddle and you know, some kind of tall tale, that's fine. And they had to go get the shotgun and all that, and it was, you know, quite something for the media to take off with. That's fine and dandy. I don't pay that kind of thing too much attention. It's worth noting. But when the man that was entrusted with Fort Jackson and training a large number of the U.S. Army personnel that came down the pipeline, this man, you talking about somebody that had a hand directly in the shape of the United States Army into what it is. You see, Fort Jackson is a very large and integral military training facility. If you're in the United States Army, you might not have went through Fort Jackson, but you sure know some folks that did. You know where it is. You done heard of it plenty of times, all right? Here is U.S. Army General Marvin B. Corder telling the government in a letter, because at the time, in 1990, it was one of those things where time to time, you know, the public would get all up, kind of worked up over the Lake Murray monster. And then, you know, the game people would say, oh, you know, there ain't even no alligators up there. Don't worry, there ain't nothing to it. Whatever. But when somebody that the government has entrusted with so much responsibility that you know has had numerous evaluations and things like that, when he tells you straight up that he and his son both have seen a 40 to 60 foot snake or eel-like creature in Lake Murray, you got to put some stock in that. That's a lot different than Billy Joe Bob and Bubba. Lake Norman, also plenty of sightings over the years. As a matter of fact, Lake Norman's probably had more contemporary sightings than any of these locations. Unfortunately, with many of the Lake Norman sightings, it's things like, and I hate to laugh because some people just don't know no better, I reckon. But the paper will pick up a story where somebody sent them a picture of some otter swimming in a cove at nighttime up there, and this local couple thinks they spotted the Lake Norman monster. No, dog, that's a beaver. You know what I mean? So it's funny to me. And it's a little bit disheartening, but bless the heart, they don't know. I guess they don't know if they see an otter what it even looks like or something. I don't know. But you see a lot of that. However, there's a lot of very, what I would say, more valid, more substantiated claims than that. Lake Norman, very, very active sightings. Most of them are in the southern part of Lake Norman, in the main channel of the lake, if you will. And of course, Lake Norman is another one of these many man-made lakes in the area. Lake Norman's about 60% of the size of Lake Murray. It's very similar to Lake Murray. The terrain is somewhat similar and whatnot. The geology in the area. The lake's just not quite as big. Lots of sightings. Of course, like many of these locations, the sightings in Lake Norman, you just get a whole mixed bag of things. You even have like people that claim to have seen something that looked like the lizard man. And they, oh, that's the Lake Norman monster. No, that's not. I don't know what you saw, but that's not the Lake Norman monster. Okay. So you just get all kind of stuff. Most of the sightings that are of interest reflect a large serpent-like creature, like General Corder described in Lake Murray. Lots of sightings, lots of contemporary sightings. A few sightings that fall in a number of different categories. But most, there again, large serpent-like creature. And nearby Lake Wiley, just down the Catawba River from Lake Norman, same thing. History of large, dark, serpent-like creature. Lake Wateree, 1987. A gentleman claimed to have hooked something that pulled his boat across the lake some considerable distance. And all he could really tell, it was very big and it had a tail like an eel. That's all he ever saw. It eventually broke his line. Big serpent-like animal with a tail like an eel. That same morphology keeps reoccurring in many of these reports. It's perhaps the most common of all these categories of types of critters being reported. Over in the PD River that is, the same thing. Oddly enough, down near the Altamaha, where the PD comes into the Atlantic Ocean, reports of a large eel-like creature. In several smaller lakes, like I just mentioned Lake Wiley, but also in the PD system, High Rock Lake, which is in a different river system, but only some 20 or 30 miles from east of Lake Norman in southern North Carolina. Same thing, history of large Eel Taipan. If you look at coastal sightings at the mouths of these rivers, and mostly just outside of the river, in more or less in that estuary area I was talking about. Two main classes of types of animals being reported. There again, the plesiosaur type, flippers, long neck, and the big giant eel type thing. This is the case near Georgetown, South Carolina in 1981, twice in Hilton Head, both in 1977 and 1996, just off Hilton Head, South Carolina, which is just, there again, off the Savannah River. Now, many of these rivers, like the Savannah, is known for two different types of sturgeon that'll come far up the river. Many different species come out of the ocean up these rivers to spawn. All manner of fish. When, as I mentioned, they built the Santee Cooper Lakes just prior to World War II, many striped bass got landlocked. And fishing in the area became famous because you could go to Lake Marion, for example, and catch a striped bass in fresh water. That was kind of a novelty thing. And some pretty good fishing and eating, too. All right, so we know that a lot of species spawn in these rivers. And the Savannah is no different, even with the sturgeon in the Savannah. But there's been odd sightings in the Savannah, too, of, there again, either a large-bodied animal with flippers and a long neck, or, you guessed it, giant eel. And it just keeps coming back around, the giant eel thing, right? Well, I look at all these different reports spanning the centuries around here. I say, well, what else you got? I mean, that's a lot of stuff. We got anything, what was going on before that? And sure enough, the Catawba Indians have a legend of a large black serpent that lives in the Catawba River. It dwells in the river, and it feeds on deer that come to drink from the river. And it'll take people too. So if you go over there to the edge of the water to get you some water in your little jar or whatever, you better look out, because it's lurking in the depths. You never really know what's lurking in the shadowy depths, do you? I mean, even that far removed from the ocean. Now, I know it seems preposterous that some kind of animal could come from the ocean and come a couple hundred miles in and crossing rapids and things like that. But we know that some eels can cross land on some level. So that's not entirely preposterous if they came from the ocean at all. And it certainly sounds like the same types of things are being seen inland and along the coast. All these different species spawning up these massive river systems, these 4 or 5 large river systems that all feed into the Atlantic in kind of a small little geographical area. Interestingly enough, all those freshwater estuaries make great shelter for species that can tolerate brackish or a little bit of fresh water. Saltwater species, and a good example is the bull shark, will come into these freshwater estuaries where these abandoned rice fields from 300 years ago are and whatnot, these marshlands, to spawn and to have children, to give birth to their young. Because the waters off of South Carolina and Georgia are particularly well known for very large sharks. Large tigers, large hammers, and large great whites, and plenty of all of them. Never a shortage of large apex predator sharks off the coast of South Carolina or Georgia. The bull sharks and other species come into the freshwater, the brackish water, to birth their young, to enhance the survival rate of the young. Because these other large, really big sharks are not brackish water tolerant. In other words, they back up into the fresh water where the bigger sharks can't tolerate the ratio of saltwater to freshwater to give their young a fighting chance, if you would. It's not outrageous to postulate that some unknown ocean species would do the same thing. if it could tolerate brackish water in the estuary like that. That's exactly where, no doubt, it would go to have its young, in all likelihood, for the very same reasons. Because there's lots of really big sharks hanging right off the coast. There's such a long history of sightings in all these places, and by some very credible people. Again, U.S. Army General is pretty tall on the list of people that ought to know what they're looking at. He's obviously a man that had a lot of sense. He was entrusted by this country with a lot of responsibility. So I'm sure they looked into his well-being on a regular basis. In other words, he's not crazy. He wasn't tripping on mushrooms. He wasn't doing anything except being real when he wrote that letter in 1990 to South Carolina Fish and Game, stating again that he and his son had on 2 different occasions seen this animal. The very same animal described by the legend of the Catawba tribe. The same animal being seen all up and down the coast here and all up and down the rivers here. What it is, I don't know, but it's something. It's not going away. It's there. I hope one day I see something like that. I've sure tried. I spent a lot of time on Lake Murray. I go to Lake Norman. You know, for a couple different reasons, Lake Norman's also a UFO hotspot, but that's a whole nother show. But I do like to go up there and sky watch and watch the lake when the weather's calm and look for those odd ripples out there, because you never know. Something's going on. It's been going on a mighty long time. Lots of strange stuff. You just never really know what's lurking in those shadowy depths. Thank you for joining me on Swamp Shadows, Tales from the Tupelo. I hope you join me next time.